So who better to join us to discuss this number one angle? And folks, we are big surprise. I'm sure everyone is shocked to hear that the number one angle on Barry's CWF page was the turning of Dusty Rhodes the night against the evil Korean Pak Song and Gary Hart. So we decided to reach out. Barry, how cool is it? Kevin Sullivan here joining us. Sully, how you doing, man?
Great. How are you guys?
We're doing well. Thank you for joining us and talking a little Dusty Rhodes turning and setting the place on fire.
Yes, he did. I think that was the second biggest turn of all times in the wrestling business. The
You
first
want to give
one
us
being Hogan.
Hogan turning and joining the NWO?
Yeah.
I just referenced that turn about 5 minutes ago. So let's set the groundwork. We're talking May 14th, 1974. We're at the Fort Hesterly Armory in Tampa, Florida. 6,000 people there to see Eddie and Mike Graham take on Dusty Rhodes and Pak Song, the Korean from Korea, as Dusty would say during the talkover segment on TV, and Gary Hart at ringside. Sully, what do you remember from that night?
Well, this had been building up for a while. It was almost impossible. Even if you wanted to keep Dusty heel, you weren't going to be able to do it. The people were cheering for him, and he had two of the greatest foils of all times, Gary Hart and Pak Song Nam. And you got to remember, the Vietnam War is still continuing. There was no other place in the world, wrestling world, as Florida to keep something legit. And Dusty, son of the plumber, his interview started to tilt a little from heel to babyface. And it blew the roof off. The people knew he was going to turn. It was just a matter of time. And they teased it enough that they thought it was going to turn earlier, and he didn't. And then they did it out of nowhere. There wasn't any tip-off that he was going to turn that night. And, of course, you know, people, we hear everybody in the wrestling business say, you know, it was sell out, they're hanging from the rafters. But I remember going to Miami after he turned babyface, and there was scalpers selling ringside tickets for $150, $200, which was unheard of. So, I mean, he was a phenomenon that comes across once in an era, and he was fabulous.
So, Barry?
Yeah, so, he's absolutely right, too. So the story that I had always heard was that it was this was something that had been building for weeks. And if you look at the team of Dusty Rhodes and Pak Song, they only teamed together maybe 3 or 4 times over like a 3-week period. And it was mostly on television, obviously, to get the most exposure. So this was a team that was put together with Gary Hart obviously being the manager so that they could break up. And Sullivan, Kevin, the story that I always heard was that Eddie Graham would come out to the arena when Dusty was wrestling, and he wouldn't look at the crowd, but he would listen to the crowd, and that's how he decided that Dusty was going to be turning. He said, he didn't make the decision, apparently. The fans made the decision. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. They couldn't have kept Dusty heel. The fans were turning him, and Eddie was master manipulator. And he knew it. He knew it. And he knew just when to pull it, too. Because you can go too far. I'll give you an example. Remember when Sabu and Taz did that? Before they wrestled, they drew that thing out. If they had gone another month, that thing would have flopped. But Dusty was Eddie's boy, too. And Eddie got to him and said, hey, we're going to make the turn, and we're going to make it in Tampa. And Eddie had mapped it out step by step to do the turn. And he did, that's the thing, he did listen to the people because the people wanted somebody. And it was the exact opposite of what they had been given as a babyface from Jack Briscoe to Dusty.
Right.
Jack was a consummate wrestler. Dusty was a consummate showman. And it was brilliant on the office's part because sometimes it's hard when you're replacing a guy to go completely opposite. And if you don't, you make it almost impossible for the other guy to get over. So if they had gone, we'll say Morocco was in and out of there at the time as a babyface. If they had gone to Morocco as the lead babyface, who looked so much like Jack at the time, it would put undue stress on Don Morocco. And I don't think he never would have gone over like Dusty did. Dusty was a phenomenon.
Well, let me ask you, in an era where kayfabe was absolutely embedded in the industry, how much about this expected turn did you guys in the dressing room know, or were you kept in the dark and you just didn't find out until that? And I'm sure you suspected that something was getting ready to happen, but was it something that was talked about in the dressing room or no?
Well, I think that everybody knew, like you guys were saying, that he couldn't be held as a heel anymore. I mean, they were starting to chant his name and pop from when he walked down the aisle. And, you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to understand they were going to pull the trigger. But Eddie pulled it in the right building, too. You said there were 6,000 people, so in Tampa Armory, that would have been to the roof. And they filmed it, as he always did, and it was over instantaneously. Because there was something the people wanted. We talked about today's era with wrestling fans who are much smarter, they're all smart, want something and we don't give it to them. Well, back in the day, I'm not going to say people believe, but they had a willing suspension of disbelief. And it was Dusty, and the territory was based on violence and also wrestling. They went hand in hand. People always say Florida was a wrestling territory. Yes, it was, but it was violence and blood on top that drew the money. And wrestling was what gave it its credibility. And Dusty we had seen the Jack Briscoe era of 90-minute matches with Dory Funk, Holly Race, Terry Funk, and then Dusty came along with his great showmanship and turned it a different way, and they didn't look back.
Yeah, and those typically too. And looking at the gates, the Dusty houses really drew tremendously, and it looked like it went from. I've always said this too, Kevin, that it went from Eddie Graham to Jack Briscoe, and then from Jack Briscoe went to Paul Jones, and then Dusty Rhodes. And Paul Jones was a very small window, kind of that bridge between Jack Briscoe and Dusty. And I don't think Paul was the guy long term, obviously, but those houses underneath Dusty, especially right after the turn, you're talking sellouts all across the state. So what was it like? What was it like working for Bill Watts at the time? And Bill Watts has to get some of this responsibility because Bill Watts was doing things there. I remember the billboard in Tampa, which would have Gary Hart in his army, and trying to collect a bounty on Dusty Rhodes. And I don't recall, up until the WWE or WCW, I don't recall anybody ever utilizing billboards before. So how was Bill Watts' role in this entire thing? How important was he to this?
I don't want to diminish Bill's role at all. That thing that he did with the billboards was brilliant, but Bill was a great listener, and he listened to a T. That was all directed by Eddie. All of it. I mean, I don't care who was the booker at any different time, whether it's Watts, Dusty, Funk, myself. On Tuesdays, Eddie was the booker. And the more you listened to Eddie, you understood that it started in Tampa and it spread through the rest of the territory. And I'm not diminishing Bill's role at all. The billboards, I don't think Eddie would have done, but Eddie and Bill probably sat down, I'm sure they did, and mapped this out for there being no mistakes on Dusty. No mistakes on Dusty. So Bill did a great job, and then it led to him. He always said he went to college in New York with Vince McMahon Sr. Then he got his PhD with Eddie Graham. And then he went on from there to, his own territory in Louisiana and blew that away. And Bill was a real good thinker and a real smart guy. And he understood so much the importance of what heat does and how you have to have a babyface fighting from the bottom. And what better babyface to fight from the bottom than Dusty, because Dusty, we don't have to mention his talking. Dusty is one of the greatest of all times.
Well, let me ask you, Kevin, as important as Dusty, of course, was, and, putting asses in the seats, he had the foil of Pak Song Nam, and you talked about, here you have the America that at the time was going through some troubles with the Nixon White House and all that kind of stuff. And here Dusty's coming out as the American dream, and you've got the foreign menace, but the foreign menace represented by Playboy Gary Hart. How important was Gary Hart to this whole scenario?
It works so well because if you ever watch Gary Hart, some managers, there's always a little bit of a twinkle in their eye when they're doing something like, hey, I know you guys are in on this. Gary played his role like Lee Van Cleef in The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. He was dead ass serious.
That is great.
And
that's a great analogy, no question.
Yes, that is great.
Yeah, he just was so serious. Because, not discounting any great managers, J.J. Kump, Bobby Heenan, there'd be times there was a twinkle in their eye. You know what I mean? When when Dusty would come in and give you the flip, flop, and fly, and then J.J. would take the holly gully, there was a little bit of showmanship in there. With Gary, he was a cold-blooded killer, and you got that. And it was one of those things that Dusty would have got over with any other manager, and he did in different times, but Gary was the catalyst to make that work, and the time, too. The country wasn't feeling good about itself. Along comes this son of a plumber who has a lisp, and he can talk. Sounds like a preacher. So everything just fell into place for them.
Yeah, and so I'm going to shift a little bit too, Kevin. So when you were first in Florida, which I believe was late '72 when you first came in, and then you formed a tag team with Mike Graham. You were multiple-time Florida tag team champions, feuding with the original Samoans, Reno Tofuli and Tio Tio for 6 months, I think, and trading the titles back and forth. And then you stuck around. You left. You came back in '77, had a brief run, and then we didn't see you again. And then you came back in the early '80s, and obviously it's when things really started to change. And at this point, you came back as a baby face and then became the main event heel, and really that run lasted off and on for the next 4 to 5 years. So how much of, when you came in too, how much of your early time spent in Florida in the 70s was in the back of your head when you came in and really started to book as well in the 80s? How much of that early training stayed with you for your time as a main event heel in the 80s?
I was very lucky that when I came in, I kind of fit the part. Mike had just started. They put us together as a team. But Eddie took a liking to me and brought me into the office, and I would be listening to what he said, and he'd be calling all the promoters. And I understood that he and Funk Sr. had this unique. Eddie copied everything Funk Sr. did, meaning the Sheriff's Boys Ranch, keeping it legit wrestling, but you got to draw with violence. You open the show with a good wrestling match. You pepper it with political stuff, where the mayor of Tampa gave me and Mike an award for our work with the youth in Florida. They gave Eddie a flag. If a police officer got killed, there was donation to his family. So even if you didn't like wrestling and you're going to knock it, when you saw that positive stuff he was doing with the community, you'd say, they turn a blind eye. And then they would get caught into the wrestling. And like I said, they would get caught in a willing suspension of disbelief. And I've never said this before, but when wrestlers became promoters, the only one that didn't kill his own territory was Eddie. He stopped wrestling at about 41 years old. He was only wrestling part-time then. The Sheik, who was a dear friend of mine, he wrestled forever. Vern Gagne was still wrestling with Nick Bockwinkel. When Hogan was up there and they wouldn't give him the belt, they kept the younger guys down, where Eddie opened the door for younger guys. He saw the business in a different light, that he saw, hey, I'm getting older. I need young talent to keep this going, and I need to keep this fresh. Where if you look at Gagne's territory, it was the same guys. And they came there and they stayed there. And that's why I think for Vern, it was so easy for him to lose the territory. And the Sheik, too, it was the same match over and over again. The Sheik wrestled, I think, about 173 times in Toronto and never lost.
Right.
So they wanted, and Dick the Bruiser was the same way. I mean, so Eddie had a leg up on them. And I think, we were talking about Watts earlier. I think Watts learned that because he stepped back from being a wrestler, where, it takes a guy that understands the business to say, I'm not the guy I used to be. It's time for me to get in the background and do what I do best, manipulate this stuff.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I know that over in Japan, that's one of the things that Giant Baba was credited with, was that he gave his spotlight to Jumbo Tsuruta. He stepped back,
right,
and that so helped his promotion move forward. And but of course, you say that about Eddie, and from the 70s, that was certainly the case, and into the early 80s. But when you start talking about the middle part of the 80s, as the business began to change, do you think Eddie had trouble adapting to the changes that were going on in the business?
I think I can remember when TBS went nationwide, and I had a talk with Eddie. He said, this is the beginning of the end. And he's right, because no matter, this is going back to the time of Tommy Rich, no matter we were landlocked. Nobody saw anything outside of Florida, right? When TBS came and they saw Tommy Rich, it was, wow, he's on a national channel. We want to see him. And Eddie was smart enough to see that the Alliance members had such big egos that they couldn't stick together and ward off this battle. I think he knew invariably it was going to go. And he knew nothing that he could do to stop it. Because I believe Florida was the last territory that Vince went in. Because Vince Sr. and Eddie had been so close.
Gotcha. Here's a question I've always wanted to ask you, Kevin, and I'm actually very happy that I got you on the phone. So looking at some of the last days of CWF, and you were there when the territory, and I guess we should clarify it, was the territory bought out by Crockett? Did Crockett take it? I've heard mixed, everybody seems to have a different story, but you were there. What happened at the very end of CWF?
From what I could gather, was that Crockett was going to lease it and then later on buy it. But I think what happened was, they had been used to, and this is no disrespect to anybody, they had been used to seeing Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, Billy Graham, everybody, Steve Kern, Briscoe, Mike Graham, and then Jimmy was sending in his seed talent. T.Joe Khan, the Mod Squad. And this is no disrespect to those guys. They were just starting. They couldn't go in those positions on top like they did. And they had plucked everybody out of Florida. Blackjack, Dusty went first, but Blackjack, Barry, Mike Rotunda, Black Bart, Ron Bass, Scott McGee, and a host of others. So all of a sudden, it was a skeleton crew, and it wasn't going to last. And Eddie had passed on, and Duke Kiyomoka and Hiro Matsuda didn't have enough connections in the wrestling business to stop Crockett from taking it over. So it became an afterthought. And, you think, here's a territory that was the most viable territory next to New York for 30 years, or almost 30 years. And it was swallowed up inside of 4 to 6 months.
One of the guys too so when you came back and you had been gone, I think you were in Continental for a bit,
right.
and then you came back to Florida, and it looks like you were bringing a couple of guys from Continental with you. But here's a name that I saw on the ads listed in the newspaper and on the programs, but I don't have one record of him ever working a match in Florida, and that is Chris Colt. Did Chris Colt ever make it to CWF?
No, he didn't. He didn't.
Okay.
Because he's heard, or somebody told, or I might even mentioned it to him, that it was over. And he stayed at Continental for a while. Nobody really knows who Chris Colt is today, but his bumps were extraordinary. I mean, anybody that ever saw Chris work, his bumps were up there with Ray Stevens. Fabulous worker, but yeah, and Barry, if you look closely, there's probably a couple other names that didn't come too, because now you weren't getting booked through the Tapper office, you were getting booked through Dusty. So rather than him bringing a guy in, he was sending the extra talent they had down to Florida.
Okay, let me ask you the next question. So as we look back on this, I found myself thinking, as Barry talked about going from Eddie to Jack to Dusty, and Dusty breaks out, becomes a national star. He's still got the base in Florida. And then you were talking about the problems that some promoters had with having trouble giving up that top spot, whether it was the Sheik or Vern Gagne or whatever. How difficult do you think it was, or maybe you know the answer to this question, how difficult was it for Eddie when he walked away from the top spot not to hand that spot to Mike? Because Mike in the ring was every bit as good as any of the other guys there. But, of course, there would have been that perception, hey, he's getting that spot because he's Dad's boy. So how tough was that for Eddie not to give that spot to Mike?
Well, here's the thing. You know how great a work Mike was. Ric Flair puts him on his top 5 opponents. And back in the day, size mattered. And he didn't want to put the extra added pressure on Mike, because he felt that the size was going against him, and what you said, the Graham name. He didn't want it to be nepotism, and he got the belt. Mike was a fabulous performer, but Mike took it because he said, I'm not the right size, and he knew it. And he said, I'm part of the company, so I'm going to get guys over. He was a real businessman. But
yeah,
I was going to say, I think that shows Eddie's genius, because he's the only guy that didn't push his kid.
Yeah. And it's something that whenever this comes up, and you can generally tell if people, because again, growing up and watching this, Mike was only pushed to a certain degree. He wasn't really working the main event, sometimes in a tag match, but for the most part, the focus was on Dusty, or it was on Don Morocco, Jack, but whoever it was. But Mike was never pushed to the roof, and Mike didn't win the Florida title. He'd been in the business for 10 years. Before he finally won the Florida title, which I believe was 1982. So I have to agree with you with that, is that, I always feel it's unjust. People will say, oh, Mike, only in wrestling because of who his father was. And it's like, you know what, you have no fucking idea what you're talking about, because as somebody that was in the arenas on a weekly basis, Mike was over. Mike was super over with the people, and an excellent worker. So, Kevin, let me ask you a question too. You were a guy. You've had a career now that goes back. I don't want to give out your age, because you're still in your 40s, if I'm correct, Kevin. So I don't want to screw this up. But you've had a career. Exactly. You're still 39. So you've had a career. So what's the one? If I had to say to you, okay, look, you were a booker in arguably, one of the biggest wrestling companies in the world. You headlined territories. You had a very creative mind. You wrote your own ticket in a lot of ways as well, because you were such a bright guy in the business. What's the one thing that you never accomplished that you always wish you could have done in professional wrestling?
I take the Cecil Page line, never look back, something maybe gaining on. I always think that tomorrow's another day. And I try to live in the moment, because if you look back in the past, it's what could have been, not what's going to be. So I got no regrets.
Gotcha. You did tell me a story once too, and I think you were really our featured guest at CWF Legends Fan Fest 2 when you were there with J.J. Dillon. But I remember you telling a story about how you were, I guess, interviewing for a position in the office in the WWE. I don't know if it was a booker or whatever it was, but I remember this was a great story. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Which, when they brought me up to go run if I was interested.
Yes.
The thing was, at the time, I had just started the gym. The gym was doing well. And you talking about when they asked me, what I had done?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of them in the office said to me, well, I really don't know what you've done. And I said, well, ask your dad. So, they didn't take that too positive. So sometimes you have to know when to hold them and when to show them. And I think I showed them when I should have held them. So it got me a little bit of heat, but we just go on. That's what I mean. You make mistakes, and everybody makes them. If you dwell on them and not learn from them, you made a mistake. If you learn from them, you grow. So sometimes it's better to shut your mouth, and I've learned that the hard way, I think, a couple of times.
Yeah, before I forget, I want to give a plug too. So Kevin is going to be on November the 9th. He is going to be in Orlando, Florida for USA Professional Wrestling. Kevin Sullivan returning to Orlando. And Kevin, any other appearances coming up over the next couple of months?
Yeah, I'm in Ripley, Mississippi in October. I'm in Dayton, Indiana in September. So I've been moving around some. I took, the summer I take off most of the time, and enjoy myself. So I'm glad to see that the wrestling business is going to take an upswing turn, I think. And I don't know what you guys think, but I think this Fox thing is going to be huge for them. I think it's going to be presented more like a sport if what they say in Fox is true. Do you think that's what they're going to do? Because it's going to be presented besides football and baseball and UFC and boxing, isn't it?
Well, I don't really know if Vince has that in his wheelhouse. Do you really think he has it in his wheelhouse at his age to change what he's presenting?
Well, what I'm saying is, isn't Fox kind of directing this? I mean, we hear all these different rumors, but I heard Fox has said they wanted it presented more like a sport. Do you think that will happen?
Well, let me ask you this question. I'll flip it on you. If Eddie had been offered a spot about 1978 or 79 when TBS was breaking national and said, we'll give you a national platform, but you have to present it as entertainment, what do you think Eddie would have said?
He would have said no.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. That Vince, that's not what he knows.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I never even kind of put that in my head, but you're right.
Yeah.
And,
now that being said, the all elite stuff, the New Japan becoming more of a recognized name in this country, all that competition is good because if it provokes Triple H and Vince to keep their product more flowing and stuff like that, and not become lazy. If it kicks them in the ass, that's always good for the product to have the head honcho get a kick in the ass and reminded that he needs to keep his product fresh.
Well, I'm going to tell you what I think is going to be the kick in the ass. I watched the UFC fight the other night. I just came in this morning from Boston, and I don't know if it was an old UFC fight because I was getting ready to go to bed, and it was Cyclops. Is that the girl's name?
Cyborg,
and another girl, and they were beating each other to death, right? And then last week or 2 weeks ago, out of Florida, they had the first pay-per-view of a bare knuckle boxing. Did you see that?
No, I did not see that.
They did 100,000 buys with no names.
Wow.
And heavyweight boxing is as healthy now as it was during Ali's heyday. The last 6 fights they've had in Wembley Stadium, the lowest has been 90,000 people. We get a lot of competition now with combat sports that are legit or presented as legit. Let's put it that way. I think we need to make some kind of adjustment if we're going to compete, because every time, like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that bare knuckle boxing was banned in every state but one. Now the ban's been lifted, and we're as consumers, we're monkey see, monkey do. So 100,000 people bought at this fight. If they get somebody with a UFC background that meant something, or a wrestling background, we'll say if it was Ming in the day and they had a bare knuckle fight, they're going to draw some money. So the competition for the entertainment dollar / sports dollar gets tighter and tighter. So I think they're going to have to go back to some kind of different presentation, because they get competition all around them. It isn't just the elite. It isn't just New Japan. It's UFC, a couple of the other MMA groups. It's pro boxing. It's the bare knuckle boxing. And how much money is there can be spread around the entertainment dollar? And that's where I think we're going to see things have to change. And like you said, with New Japan and All Elite, I think these guys are going to have to hone up their game.
Sure, that's a valid point. So let me ask you, first of all, we certainly appreciate you taking time out. As you said, you just flew in today and you've taken some time with us, and we are very appreciative of you doing that, Kev. So here's a question I asked Barry earlier in the show, and I want to get your response without telling you what Barry's answer was. Okay. People always talk about a Mount Rushmore. Okay. Mount Rushmore, the greatest players in Red Sox history or Yankees or sports. So tell me, if you were going to do a Mount Rushmore of CWF over the course of its history, tell me who the 4 guys are you're having on that mountaintop.
Eddie Graham, Jack Briscoe, Dusty Rhodes, and Terry Funk.
All right. Barry, you want to tell them who yours were?
Yeah, and I had 5. How many people are? Is it 4 on the mount, or is it 5?
It's 4. Apparently, you're on Mount Everest, Barry.
I'm on Mount Everest, where I put 5 up there because it's a bigger mount, so I figure I could do that. So I had Eddie Graham, Dusty Rhodes, Jack Briscoe, Gordon Soley, and Cowboy Luttrell. would be the 5.
That's very good. I forgot about Gordon. Gordon definitely be my 5th.
Yeah, and he was a guy that I just said was so intertwined with the history of the promotion. You know, a guy that never set foot in the ring, but he meant so much to the promotion. I mean, there's no way you can keep him off it. But I mean, I didn't include guys that were necessarily outside the ring. So now here's another question I asked Barry that I'll be interested. Taking yourself out of the equation, because of course you did have a legendary feud with Dusty Rhodes. So when you think back on Dusty Rhodes' best rival of all time, give me 4 or 5 names, and then give me the one that you think was his ultimate number one rival.
I'll give you the one first. Terry Funk.
Boom! That's exactly what I said, Kevin. There you go.
Yeah. I mean, we all bow to Terry. I mean, after Terry, it's Terry, then the rest of us, you know. But I mean, Terry, Pak Song, you know, and you got to put Pak Song up there, even though he was the one that kicked it off. He was the granddaddy. He was Harry Freese, you know, the guy that traded Babe Ruth to the Red Sox. I mean, from the Red Sox, you know. He's the one that started the American dream. So him, Terry, I guess, superstar Billy Graham, because it went nationwide, right?
Yep.
And maybe Abdullah.
So, Barry, why don't you tell him the ones that you mentioned that he hasn't?
Yeah, absolutely, too. So we agreed on Terry Funk. We agreed on Superstar Billy Graham. And I believe, because Superstar says this, that Dusty said that was one of his favorite opponents to work with. You're obviously on the list as well. I also put up the Assassin and the Missouri Mauler, because I thought those two really had something. And Pak Song we also agreed on. So I think it was, Jeff, what was the difference? Was it the Assassin and Missouri Mauler that I said?
Well, I think you're leaving out Ernie Ladd.
And Ernie Ladd, right, exactly. I said Ernie Ladd as well, which is also a great feud that he had.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it was.
So, well, Sully, we certainly appreciate your time. Hey, wanted to ask you, while you were in Boston, I know you spent a little time there. If you're going to Boston, outside of seeing the Red Sox, maybe visiting some family, what restaurant you going to go have dinner at in Boston?
I go to the ye old Union Oyster House. It's been in existence from, I think, 1760. In the doorways, it shows you how small the people were. In the doorways, I even have to duck my head. And it's a great seafood place. And then there's Jimmy's by the harbor side, and the Charter House. There's a lot of great restaurants there. You know, you can't go wrong. Great seafood. But I'd put the Seattle seafood above Boston seafood.
Really? Now that's breaking kayfabe right there, buddy.
Yeah.
And Kevin, do you like ice cream? Do you eat a lot of ice cream at all?
Yeah, I love ice cream. Ice cream. Yeah.
There is a place in Boston. I was in Boston not last summer, the summer before, and somebody turned me on to a place called JP Licks. Have you ever heard of this company? There are like 16 or 17 in around Boston and I guess the suburbs, and that was some of the best. They had a flavor. It was Nomar Garcia Cherry or something, named after the baseball player, but it was full of. It was like the best fucking ice cream I'd ever had in my life, Kevin. Have you ever been to this spot, JP Licks?
No, I haven't. But there used to be an ice cream place called Bedford Farms. And ice cream was made in the town of Bedford and made by their own cows. And this is before people were into organic stuff, but it was all organic, and it was unbelievable. They had a thing called a bucket, and there was 2 scoops of vanilla, 2 scoops of chocolate, 2 scoops of strawberry, and then they had fresh strawberries, fresh pineapple, bananas, and homemade whipped cream on it. Oh, to die for.
All right. Well, listen, hey, buddy, we certainly want to give you our thanks for taking time out of your day. As I said, you flew back in and you agreed to be on the show with us, and we really appreciate it because we wanted to know what it was like, feet on the ground there at the Hesterly Armory the night that Dusty turned. And Kevin Sullivan, on behalf of Burr, we really appreciate your time, my man.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
All right. You have a good one.
Bye-bye.